The wind moved across the open Texas plains like a whisper carrying old secrets. It rattled the dry grass, brushed against the empty corral, and curled around the lone ranch house standing silent beneath a stretch of cold sky. Inside that house, a single lantern burned, its faint light trembling against the wooden walls. The man who kept it lit was named Eli Walker. For 10 winters, he had lived out there alone, surrounded only by the breath of his horses and the quiet ache of memories too heavy to let go. Every morning before sunrise, he saddled up his mare, rode the fence lines, and checked the troughs. Every evening, he came home to the same half-warmed stew, the same chair by the window, and the same sound of wind against the roof. Life was steady, but it was hollow, a rhythm with no song. They said he used to smile once. Folks in town remembered the way he'd walk down Main Street with a woman at his side, her laughter echoing like silver bells. Her name was Clara, and she had brought sunshine into his rough world. But sickness came early and stayed long, taking her one quiet spring morning, leaving Eli with a ranch that no longer felt alive. Since then, his days blurred into one long season of silence. That night, the cold came harder than usual. A storm had rolled in from the north, gray and merciless. Snowflakes drifted like ash across the fields, coating everything in white. Eli had pulled his coat tighter and gone out to check the barn doors, making sure the horses were safe. When he came back in, he stirred the fire, poured himself a measure of whiskey, and sat by the window, listening to the wind hum its lonely song. Some nights were harder than others, and this was one of them. He thought about how the world seemed to keep moving even when a man didn't want it to. He thought about the last words Clara had spoken to him, about the promise he made to keep the ranch running, even when his heart was too tired to try. And somewhere between those thoughts and the crackle of the fire, he almost didn't hear the sound at first. Faint, uncertain, and foreign. A knock. It came again, louder this time, desperate against the wind. Eli set down his glass and stood. Nobody came out this far unless they had a reason. He opened the door just enough to see a figure bent against the storm. A woman, wrapped in a tattered coat, her hair tangled with snow. She was shivering, her voice nearly gone when she tried to speak. He stepped aside, motioning her in, and she crossed the threshold without hesitation, collapsing near the fire like someone who hadn't seen warmth in days. She didn't say her name right away. She only looked at him through strands of wet hair and whispered something about the road, about getting lost in the storm. Her boots were soaked, her hands scraped. Eli fetched a blanket, handed it to her, and sat across the room, studying her in the quiet glow of the flames. There was something strange about her presence, not in a dangerous way, but in the kind of way that stirred something long buried. She looked like she'd come a long way, maybe from somewhere she didn't want to return to. For a long while, they sat there in silence, the storm screaming outside. Eli thought about asking her what she was running from, but the look in her eyes told him he already knew. Everyone out here was running from something. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but steady. She said she'd been traveling from one town to another, taking whatever work she could find. Said the train had broken down miles back, and she'd followed the dirt road until the snow swallowed it. Eli listened, not interrupting, his eyes fixed on the fire. She said her name was Mara. Something about the way she said it felt final, like a confession. He nodded slowly, repeating it in his mind. Mara. The sound of it felt warm, even in the cold. As the night deepened, she sat closer to the fire, her face softening in the light. The coat slipped from her shoulders, revealing a simple dress beneath, worn, faded but clean. She looked like someone who had once belonged to something good but had been wandering too long to remember what that felt like. Eli poured her some coffee, and she took it with both hands, trying to stop the trembling. She thanked him quietly, then looked toward the window, where snow kept falling thick and endless. She asked if he lived alone, and he said yes. She asked if he liked it that way, and he said no. Then neither spoke again. The storm howled through the night, shaking the shutters, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote cried. The wind whistled through the eaves, and Eli thought about how strange it was. the way loneliness could live so quietly inside a man, until the sound of another voice reminded him it was there. By the time the fire burned low, Mara had fallen asleep in the chair, her head resting against the wall. Eli covered her with another blanket and sat back down, staring at her in the flickering light. There was something about her that didn't belong to this world of dust and silence. Something soft, something dangerous. Outside, the snow kept falling, erasing every track that led to or away from the ranch. And though Eli didn't know it yet, that storm would be remembered as the night everything began to change. Morning came slow, gray, and silent. The storm had eased, but the world outside still lay buried under white. Eli stirred the fire back to life, its orange glow washing over the rough boards of the cabin. The smell of coffee and smoke filled the air, steady and comforting. Mara woke to the crackle of the fire, blinking against the dim light. For a heartbeat she looked lost, as if unsure where she was, then memory returned. The storm, the stranger, the warmth she hadn't felt in weeks. Eli said little. He cooked bacon on the skillet, poured her coffee, and slid a plate toward her. She ate quietly, eyes flicking toward him now and then, as if measuring the man who'd opened his door to her without a question. After breakfast, Eli went to the barn to check on the horses. Mara followed, wrapping herself in his old coat that nearly swallowed her. The barn smelled of hay and leather and animal breath. The horses nickered softly when they saw him, and she watched how gently he moved among them, how his hands, rough as bark, could stroke a frightened mare until she stilled. She asked about the names painted above each stall, and he told her a few: Ranger, Dusty, Belle, each spoken like a memory. When she asked about one empty stall near the corner, he hesitated before answering. That one belonged to Clara's favorite horse. The name had long faded from the wood. Mara said nothing. She only touched the gate of the empty stall, tracing the faint letters with her fingertips. As the morning wore on, the sky cleared. Sunlight hit the snow, turning the fields into a sea of blinding silver. Eli showed her where the well was, where the creek ran in summer, and the hill that overlooked the whole valley. It wasn't much, but when he spoke of it, she could hear the quiet pride beneath his voice. When they returned to the house, Mara stood by the window, staring out across the wide white land. She said it was the most peaceful place she'd ever seen. Eli said peace was easy to find when a man didn't have much left to lose. Her eyes turned to him then, sharp and curious. She asked what he'd lost, and he almost told her. Almost. But instead he said he had work to do and stepped outside. He spent the next few hours chopping wood, though the pile was already high. Mara watched from the doorway, the sun glinting off his shoulders each time he swung the axe. There was a steadiness in him that drew her in. Something solid, unhurried, unbroken by time or sorrow. When he finally stopped, she handed him water and said softly that he didn't have to pretend she wasn't there. He looked at her for a long moment, the wind tugging at his hair, then nodded once. That simple gesture meant more than words. By dusk, clouds had gathered again. The cold deepened, and the smell of coming snow drifted through the air. They ate supper together: beans, bread, a bit of jerky, and afterward sat near the fire. Mara asked if he ever went into town. He said only when he had to. People there talked too much and meant too little. She smiled, saying she understood. Eli studied her in the firelight. She had the kind of face that seemed both fragile and fierce at once. There was grace in her movements, but also the exhaustion of someone who'd spent years surviving. He asked what had brought her so far from the railroads and towns. For a moment, she looked like she might lie. Then she told him about a man named Kane who'd promised her work and safety, then taken everything she had instead. When she ran, she carried something that wasn't hers but wasn't his either. A satchel full of money meant for people he'd cheated. She'd been running ever since, hoping to find a way to make it right. Eli listened, the muscles in his jaw tightening. Out here, a person's sins didn't matter as much as their truth, and he could see hers plain enough. She was tired, hunted, but not cruel. He told her she could stay a few days, just until the storm broke for good. She nodded, grateful, but there was a flicker of fear in her eyes. a look that said she didn't believe peace could last. That night, when the wind rose again, Eli heard her footsteps pacing the floor long after he'd gone to bed. The boards creaked, soft and restless. When he stepped into the main room, she was standing at the window, staring into the dark. She said she thought she'd seen a lantern moving out near the ridge. Eli looked, but there was nothing now, just the wind stirring the snow. He told her it was probably nothing, though a knot tightened in his chest. She turned toward him, worry written across her face. He said she should get some sleep, that whatever ghosts were out there couldn't cross the cold. When she finally lay down, he sat awake by the dying fire, the rifle across his knees. The sound of the storm outside felt different now, less lonely, more like a warning. And as he watched the shadows move across the walls, Eli realized he wasn't just keeping watch for her safety. Somewhere deep down, he knew he was keeping watch over something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Morning came dull and windless, the kind of stillness that only follows a long storm. The world outside the ranch looked untouched, blank and bright under a pale sun. But inside the cabin, something had shifted. Eli moved through the rooms with quiet purpose, checking the windows, the latch on the door, the rifle by the hearth. Mara watched him, her expression unreadable. She asked if he'd slept, and he said not much. Then she asked if he'd seen the light again, and he said no, but the unease in his voice said otherwise. They ate breakfast in near silence, though neither could stop thinking about that flicker on the ridge. Out here, a single light in the wrong place could mean anything, a hunter, a drifter, or worse. When Eli stepped out to tend the horses, Mara followed, her breath fogging in the cold air. She asked if he thought the man she'd mentioned, Cain, might have followed her this far. Eli didn't answer right away. He ran a hand down the mare's neck, then looked up at her. He said men like Cain didn't let go easy, not when money was involved. She said quietly that the satchel was buried behind the house, under a pile of firewood. Eli nodded once, told her it could stay there until they figured out what to do. Through the rest of the day, they kept close to the house. Mara helped patch an old fence, her fingers numb but steady. Eli showed her how to drive nails through ice-hardened boards, and she smiled when she managed to hit straight. For a while, it almost felt like normal life, the kind neither of them had dared to imagine again. When evening came, they sat on the porch steps, watching the sun sink low behind the hills. The sky turned orange, then violet, then a deep, endless blue. Mara said she couldn't remember the last time she'd watched a sunset in peace. Eli said the sky always looked bigger out here, like it had room for every mistake a person ever made. She laughed softly, then turned serious. She asked why he never left, why he stayed after losing everything. He told her the truth, that leaving wouldn't have brought Clara back, and staying gave him a reason to keep breathing. He said the land still knew his name even if no one else did. Mara looked at him for a long moment, and something warm flickered between them. Quiet, unspoken, but real. Later that night, when the lamps were out and only the firelight glowed, Eli heard a sound again. Not wind this time, hooves, slow, deliberate somewhere near the ridge. He rose, moved to the window, and saw a shadow crossing the snow, leading a horse. The figure paused, looking toward the house, then vanished behind the line of trees. Eli reached for his rifle. Mara was already standing, pale and alert. She said his name softly, and he told her to stay back. He stepped out into the cold, boots crunching in the snow, his breath white in the moonlight. The wind was still. The only sound was the creak of old wood and the distant cry of an owl. He followed the tracks toward the barn, each print fresh and heavy. When he reached the door, he found it half open. Inside, one of the horses snorted nervously. Eli raised the rifle, easing forward. The smell of hay and leather filled the air. Then he saw movement, a shape slipping behind the far stall. He spoke low, steady, warning whoever it was to come out slow. A man stepped into view, tall and broad-shouldered, his face hidden by the brim of his hat. He smiled thinly, voice rough as gravel. He said he was just looking for shelter, that the storm had caught him out. Eli told him the storm had ended a day ago. The stranger's eyes gleamed under the hat brim. He said he'd been following the tracks of a woman, someone who'd taken something that wasn't hers. Eli felt the air tighten. He said no one here fit that description. The man smiled again, said maybe he was mistaken, then tipped his hat and walked out slow. But before he mounted his horse, he looked back toward the cabin and said something that made Eli's blood run cold. He said, "Tell her Cain sends his regards." By the time Eli reached the porch again, the man was gone. Mara stood waiting, wrapped in his coat, her face ashen. She didn't ask what was said. She already knew. She told him the truth then, the whole of it. Cain wasn't just a thief. He was a man who made his living breaking people, taking from them until they had nothing left. She'd worked for him once, thinking it was honest money. But when she found out what he'd done, how many he'd ruined, she took the ledger that proved his crimes, along with the cash he'd stolen. That was what she'd been carrying, what he'd been chasing her for. Eli stood silent for a long time. Then he said she wasn't going back, not while he was breathing. Mara's eyes glistened in the firelight. She asked why he would risk himself for someone he barely knew. Eli said something simple, something true. Because sometimes the soul recognizes another before the mind has time to argue. They stood close then, the fire between them throwing soft light on their faces. Neither reached for the other, but something in the air shifted. The storm outside was gone, but another had begun. Quiet, warm, impossible to ignore. When she finally slept that night, Eli sat by the window watching the dark fields. Somewhere far off, a lone coyote called into the cold. And Eli understood, for the first time in years, what it meant to care again. How it scared a man more than any bullet could. Because love wasn't gentle, not out here. It came like weather. Sudden, unstoppable, and always leaving its mark. By the time dawn broke over the ranch, the air was heavy with that strange stillness that comes before something happens. Something you can feel but can't see. The snow had hardened overnight, shining like glass under the pale gold light. Eli stood outside, hat pulled low, eyes fixed on the horizon. He hadn't slept. His hands were steady, but his heart wasn't. Somewhere out there, Cain was moving. He could sense it, the way a horse senses a storm long before the thunder. Inside, Mara was packing a small bag. She said she didn't want to bring trouble to his doorstep. Eli told her she already had, and that it wasn't leaving without a fight. She hesitated, her eyes soft with guilt and gratitude. "You shouldn't have to be part of this," she said. Eli looked at her then, really looked, and the words came quiet but firm. "You made this place feel alive again. That's more than I've had in 10 years. I'll be damned if I let anyone take that away." Mara turned away, blinking back tears. She didn't know whether to stay or run, but the truth was, she'd stopped wanting to run the night he kissed her. The day stretched long and tense. Every sound outside, a creak of wood, a crow's call, felt too loud. They went about chores they didn't need to do, anything to keep their hands busy. By late afternoon, the wind picked up. Clouds gathered low, carrying the color of steel. Eli was in the barn mending a bridle when he saw dust on the ridge. Faint, rising slow. One rider, moving steady. He walked back to the house and told Mara to lock the door. She didn't argue this time. When the rider came closer, Eli could see the gleam of a revolver at his hip and the dark coat that flapped behind him like wings. Cain dismounted with practiced ease. He called out before he reached the porch. "Afternoon, Cowboy. I reckon you've got something that belongs to me." Eli stood in the doorway, rifle in hand, eyes like flint. "Don't reckon I do." Cain smiled, the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Pretty thing, isn't she? She ever tell you she's good at lying?" Eli didn't answer. Cain took a step closer. "She's got something of mine. A ledger. You know what's written in it? Names. Numbers. Enough to get a man like me buried under the law. I can't have that. So, you hand her over, and maybe I'll let you keep breathing." Inside, Mara heard every word. Her hands trembled as she opened the window just enough to see. Eli said calmly, "She's not yours to take." Cain chuckled low, his fingers brushing the gun at his hip. "You think you can stand between me and what's mine?" I ain't thinkin', Eli said. I'm tellin' da. For a heartbeat, silence. Then the sound of a hammer pulling back. The first shot split the air like thunder. Eli dove for cover behind the porch rail, his rifle firing back with a crack that echoed through the valley. Wood splintered. Snow kicked up. Horses neighed in terror. Mara screamed his name, but he shouted for her to stay inside. Cain moved fast, ducking behind a trough, firing again. The bullet tore through the porch post inches from Eli's head. He fired once more, this time catching Cain's shoulder. The outlaw stumbled back, snarling, hand pressed to his wound. He looked toward the cabin, then back at Eli. His voice turned cold. You just signed her death sentence, cowboy. Before Eli could move, Cain threw something, a lit lantern. It smashed against the porch, flames licking up the wood. Eli ran for the door, shouting Mara's name. She was already there with a bucket of water, dousing the flames, coughing through the smoke. Cain used the moment to flee, mounting his horse and vanishing into the trees, leaving behind only a trail of blood and the faint echo of laughter carried by the wind. That night, the ranch smelled of smoke and rain. The storm broke at last, washing the ashes from the porch. Inside, Mara sat by the fire, shaking, her face pale and tear-streaked. Eli knelt beside her, gently taking her hands. She whispered that she was sorry, that he shouldn't have had to fight for her. He told her there was nothing to be sorry for, that maybe for once in his life, he'd found something worth fighting for. The words hung between them, fragile and raw. Then, as thunder rolled in the distance, Mara leaned in, her forehead resting against his. Their breath mingled in the dim light, and the world outside faded away. When he kissed her this time, it wasn't desperate. It was real, quiet, and steady, like two souls that had finally stopped running. The fire crackled softly. Her fingers brushed the edge of his jaw, tracing the scar that ran along it. He closed his eyes, not from pain but from the weight of everything he felt. Outside, the rain whispered against the windows, gentle and endless, as if the sky itself was washing away their past. And somewhere, deep down, Eli knew it wasn't over. Cain would return. But for this one night, one rare, impossible night, the world had given them peace. When morning came, the sky over the ranch was washed in a pale gold that looked almost holy. The rain had cleared, leaving every blade of grass shining, every fence post glistening with dew. The air was cool and alive, filled with the smell of wet earth and smoke fading from the night before. Eli stood by the fence, his hat low, watching the horizon again. The same horizon he'd watched for 10 years, waiting for something he never thought he'd find. Only now he wasn't waiting anymore. She was inside, asleep by the fire, wrapped in one of his old wool blankets, her hair loose and tangled, her face soft in rest. He didn't know what came next. He only knew he wanted her to wake up to a world where she didn't have to run. When she finally did, her voice was hoarse, her first words quiet as the wind. He'll come back. Eli didn't look at her, just tightened the strap on his saddle. I'm countin' on it. She rose, the blanket slipping from her shoulders. You don't have to do this. He turned then, his eyes steady, but the look in them made her heart twist. I've run from a lot in my life, Mara. Not anymore. Not when there's someone worth standin' for. He said it like a vow, and she felt it like one. By noon, the sky had cleared completely. The sun burned bright, and the world looked peaceful again. Too peaceful. That's when the sound came. Hoofbeats. Distant, then closer. The same rhythm she remembered from before, the rhythm of trouble. Cain was back. Eli mounted his horse, the rifle strapped to the saddle. He turned to Mara, who stood on the porch, fear and defiance tangled in her eyes. If anything happens, take the back trail through the woods, he said. But she didn't move. If you ride into this alone, there's no coming back. He gave her a faint smile. Then I'll just have to come back. He tipped his hat and rode out. The land stretched wide and silent, the sun high above, casting long shadows. Cain waited by the river bend, blood-stained bandage around his shoulder, revolver gleaming in his hand. He looked like a man who had lost everything except hate. When Eli rode up, he didn't speak at first. The two men just stared at each other across that narrow stretch of grass and water. The outlaw and the cowboy, both marked by pain, both fighting for something that couldn't coexist. Cain broke the silence. "She ain't yours." Eli's reply was quiet. "Maybe not, but she sure as hell ain't yours either." Cain's laugh was hollow. "You don't know her. Don't know what she's done." "I don't care," Eli said. "Whatever she's done, she's more honest than you've ever been." That was the last word between them before the world exploded again. Gunfire ringing across the valley, horses rearing, the smell of gunpowder thick in the air. Eli fired first, the shot grazing Cain's leg. Cain stumbled, dropped to one knee, fired back. The bullet hit Eli's shoulder, spinning him off balance. He grunted, bit down the pain, reloaded. The next shot hit true. Cain fell hard, the gun slipping from his hand, the sound of the river the only thing left moving. Eli dismounted slowly, clutching his wound. He stood over the man, breath ragged, eyes hard. Cain looked up at him with a twisted grin. "She'll leave you too, cowboy. They always do." Eli shook his head. "Not her." And with that, he turned and walked away, leaving the outlaw to the wind. When he rode back to the ranch, the sun was dipping low again, gold bleeding into crimson. Mara stood there waiting, her hands trembling, eyes searching every inch of him for life. When she saw the blood, she ran to him. He slid off the saddle before she reached him, his knees weak, the pain finally catching up. She caught him before he hit the ground. "Eli!" she cried, her hands on his face, her tears falling onto his skin. He smiled faintly. "Told you I'd come back." She pressed her forehead to his, whispering over and over, "Don't you leave me now." He didn't. Not that night. Weeks passed. The wound healed, slowly. The days turned warmer. The world around them softened. Mara stayed, at first to help, then because she couldn't imagine leaving. Together they rebuilt what the fire had taken. A new fence, a new roof, a new kind of quiet that felt more like peace than loneliness. Sometimes she'd find him staring at the horizon again, but it was different now. He wasn't waiting, he was remembering. One evening, as the sun melted into the earth, she came to him with 2 mugs of coffee. "You still think about that night?" she asked. He smiled a little. "Every damn day." She set the mugs down and leaned against the fence beside him. "Do you ever wish it hadn't happened?" He thought for a long moment. Then he shook his head. "No, because if it hadn't, I'd still be out here talking to the stars, wondering what it felt like to be alive." She turned toward him then, her hand finding his. The air between them shimmered with the soft gold of the setting sun. He looked at her, really looked, and for the first time in his life Eli felt something stronger than regret. He felt home. Years later, long after the smoke and the storm, people who passed by that ranch would sometimes see 2 figures sitting on the porch as the sun went down. The man with the weathered face and the woman with the quiet smile. They never knew their story, how a stranger's knock on a cold night changed everything. But sometimes, if you listened close when the wind blew across those open fields, you could almost hear it. Her laughter, his low drawl, and the echo of a kiss that turned loneliness into love. The kind of love that doesn't fade, even when the world forgets. Because out there under the wide Texas sky, love doesn't end with a promise. It begins with one.